The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in a glass box, and Katie Morrison moved through Seattle General's trauma bay with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that wasted motion cost lives. Her left leg favored slightly with each step, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it, and Dr. Caldwell was always watching. The titanium rod in her femur ached where the barometric pressure had dropped that afternoon, a weather report written in bone and metal. She wore her scrubs like armor, pale blue, pockets stuffed with trauma shears and a penlight, and one object she never took off shift, a single dog tag on a broken chain, carried against her ribs like a confession she couldn't speak aloud. 6 years. She'd kept it 6 years. The ER doors hissed open at 18:47 hours. A gurney rolled through, a construction worker with a gash that needed stitches, and Katie was already moving, assessing, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she helped transfer him to bed 3. Vitals called out. Blood pressure 142/88. Heart rate 96. O2 sat 98 on room air. The usual Friday night inventory of the fragile. She'd worked 4,247 shifts in the past 11 years, she kept count, though she never said it aloud, and muscle memory had become something deeper than habit. It was architecture. Her body knew the angles of a trauma bay the way a soldier knew the smell of cordite. The way a swimmer knew water. That was the moment Caldwell appeared, white coat pristine, hair exactly in place, smile calibrated to hit somewhere between charm and contempt. His presence made the fluorescent light seem smaller somehow, like the air pressure changed when he walked past. He was checking charts, moving methodically, and he paused at bed 3 to watch Katie work. Just long enough to let her know he was assessing. Just long enough to make it clear that the assessment was happening on his terms. Efficient, he said. It wasn't a compliment. The way he said it made efficiency sound like a kind of arrogance, a refusal to accept the natural hierarchy where doctors thought and nurses executed. Katie didn't look up from the construction worker's laceration. Her voice came out soft, deferential, the way she'd learned to speak in this hospital. Just trying to keep up, doctor. See that you do. He moved on, and she felt the weight of his gaze shift to the next bay, the next nurse, the next domain he owned. The dog tag pressed against her sternum, heavier than metal should be. Her fingers found it through the fabric of her scrubs, a habit so ingrained she barely noticed when she did it anymore. The chain was broken, had been broken since the funeral, and she'd never bothered to get it repaired. Some breaks were meant to stay broken. Some things were meant to remind you of what you couldn't save. By 1900 hours, the ER had that particular brand of Friday night chaos that felt almost peaceful by contrast to what was coming. 3 minor lacerations. A diabetic patient checking his blood sugar. A woman with chest pain who was probably fine but was being admitted anyway because that's what happened when people came to hospitals, they got admitted. Katie was restocking the crash cart in Bay 4 when the scanner crackled. That distinctive sound, radio static cutting through the ambient hum like someone had just decided to change everything. Attention all staff. Inbound trauma. Navy SEAL, training accident, massive hemorrhage, ETA for minutes. Trauma Bay 1 and 2 standing by. Katie's hand stilled on the code cards for setup. Navy SEAL. Training accident. Massive hemorrhage. Those words came in a specific sequence that meant something precise in medical language, meant that whoever was coming through those doors was already half dead, and the next 4 minutes would determine whether the hospital saved them or collected them. She pulled the dog tag out through her scrub neckline. Let it sit against the surface of her skin where she could feel it. The chain was broken in 3 places, held together by nothing but habit and the weight of 6 years of carrying it. Caldwell materialized beside her, moving with the confidence of a man who'd spent his entire career having doors open before him and people step aside. "We're implementing Protocol 7 for this one," he said. His voice had changed slightly, there was an edge underneath it now, sharper than before. "Standard resuscitation guidelines only. Understand?" "Yes, doctor," Katie said. She was very still. "I have my board approval meeting Monday morning." the hospital's trauma mortality statistics are going to be under scrutiny. Every case, every decision, every minute on the code timer is going to be documented and reviewed. He paused, and she could feel him waiting for her to acknowledge the implication. That lives were good. That successful outcomes looked good. That unsuccessful outcomes looked bad, and he didn't look bad. He never looked bad. We need clean numbers, Morrison. Not heroics. Clean numbers. Katie nodded. She'd worked long enough in civilian medicine to understand this language. It was a dialect she'd never learned in Fallujah or Tikrit, a way of talking where patients became statistics and statistics became career trajectory. Where the difference between trying and not trying was measured in how things looked on a spreadsheet at a board meeting on a Monday morning. The police scanner crackled again. Update on the inbound. Vitals unstable. No pulse obtained in the field. 2 units of O negative already running. ETA 3 minutes 40 seconds. Katie's chest had gone very quiet. The name came through the scanner next, professional and clipped. Lieutenant Marcus Chen. Navy SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. She heard her own breathing shift slightly, though her face didn't change. The dog tag felt like it was burning through her palm. Marcus Chen was her son's commanding officer. Had been her son's commanding officer back when her son was still in Tikrit with a rifle and a Kevlar helmet and a mother who couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could only stand in her kitchen and touch a dog tag on a broken chain and wonder if today was the day her child came home in a box. Marcus Chen was the man her son wrote about in those rare emails. Said his commander was sharp. Said his commander didn't waste words or soldiers. Said his commander knew how to get men home. Caldwell's pager buzzed. He checked it, and something flickered across his face, some calculation about mortality statistics and board approval and the way a high-profile patient could go either way. Could be a success story that looked good on a resume. Could be a failure that looked worse. 1 minute, the scanner said. Katie pulled a fresh set of gloves from the box and snapped them on. The sound was sharp, definitive, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Around her, the ER staff shifted into position. The trauma bays went quiet in that specific way hospitals went quiet when incoming was about to hit, that held breath pause before impact. Caldwell checked his watch. His jaw was set in a way that said he was already calculating outcomes, already deciding what Protocol 7 meant in terms of aggressiveness and what Protocol 7 would protect him from if things didn't go the way he wanted. He looked at Katie once, just briefly, and his eyes held something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. She wasn't sure there was a difference. 3 nurses, Caldwell said to the charge nurse. But not Morrison. I want her on backup, cart management only. Nothing critical. Katie's hands were very steady. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just nodded and moved to where she was told to move, where she could see everything but couldn't touch anything, couldn't intervene, couldn't do the thing she was built to do better than almost anyone in this hospital. Cart management. Back up. The word was a kind of erasure. The ER doors hissed open. Wheels squeaked on tile. Multiple voices calling out simultaneously, the organized chaos of a trauma alert where everyone knew their position and the patient had maybe 4 minutes before the window of salvation closed forever. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the part that made her grip the dog tag so hard the broken edges cut into her palm. The trauma team surrounded the stretcher, and Katie caught one glimpse of the patient's face as they rolled past, young, seal young, the kind of focused intensity that lived in the shoulders and jaw even when the body was barely functional. He had blood on his uniform. Had the particular grey color of someone whose vessels had been entered into places they shouldn't be. But his eyes, there was still intelligence behind them. Still the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. His eyes found hers for exactly 1 second as they passed, and she saw recognition flicker there. Just for a moment. Just long enough for him to know that someone in this room knew what he was. What he'd done. What his commanding officer meant in the language of military respect. Then he was gone into the trauma bay, doors closing, and Katie was left standing in the ER with a dog tag in one hand and the sound of the heart monitor starting up in the other, and she understood with absolute clarity that Dr. Caldwell had just locked her out of saving the one patient she might have been able to save. The question was whether she was going to accept that. Whether she was going to follow Protocol 7 and clean statistics and board approval meetings and let Marcus Chen die on the table because his mortality would look bad on a spreadsheet. Or whether she was going to remember who she actually was underneath these scrubs. The room went very quiet. You could hear the fluorescent lights humming. The doors exploded inward at 2,247 hours. Trauma Bay 4, but the blood came before the gurney, arterial spray painting the ceiling tiles in a question mark that nobody wanted answered. Navy SEAL Lieutenant Marcus Chen, exsanguinating at 70/40, his combat uniform already cut away, the medic riding his chest doing compressions that looked like they were breaking bones. They probably were. Katie Morrison was 2 steps into the room when she saw his name taped through the chaos, and the dog tag inside her scrub pocket grew so heavy she thought it might fall through the fabric and shatter on the tile. Chen. The same Chen who commanded her son's team in Tikrit. The same Chen who'd written a letter 6 months ago, "Your boy's doing fine, you raised him right." 2 units in the field, the medic called out. No response. Pressure's dropping. Katie was already moving, gloved hands finding and foresight, calling for packed cells, reading the monitor like it was screaming at her in a language only she understood. The heart rate was 142 and climbing, the oxygen saturation somewhere between critical and gone. She'd seen this before. In Baghdad. In a field hospital outside Fallujah where the walls were canvas and the mortars came in 3s. She knew what exsanguination looked like. She knew what it sounded like, that hollow, wet sound when the body starts running on fumes. Caldwell appeared like a shadow at the edge of the bay, watching. Not helping. Watching. His eyes moved from the monitor to Katie's hands to Chen's face, and his mouth made a thin line like he'd tasted something bitter. Then he turned and walked back out. Katie kept working. 2 more units of O-negative. The pressure climbed to 80/50 for maybe 10 seconds, then started falling again. She was halfway through ordering a 3rd unit when Caldwell's hand found her elbow, firm grip, the kind that wasn't quite violent but was announcing that it could be. He pulled her toward the corner, away from the resident and the tech and the machines that beeped like mechanical hearts having anxiety attacks. "This one's a lost cause, Morrison." His voice was soft. That was the dangerous part. The softness. Exsanguination protocol. We're not inflating our code times for a statistic. Katie looked back at Chen. His lips were already changing color, that dusky blue-gray that meant the oxygen was gone and the organs were dying by committee. But his left eye was still open. Still looking for something. Still fighting. Hybrid resuscitation, Katie said quietly. Permissive hypertension until we get him to the OR. Delayed crystalloid, massive transfusion protocol. He's young, he's a SEAL, his physiology. No. Caldwell released her elbow and walked back toward the nurse's station, and Katie felt the word hang in the air like smoke. He picked up the overhead microphone. The entire trauma bay froze. She'd seen it happen 100 times, that moment when everyone realized a voice was about to come through the speakers, and everyone tensed like they were about to be called into the principal's office. His voice boomed through every speaker on the 3rd floor, smooth and professional and loud enough to make the monitors seem quiet. Nurse Nightingale to administration. Nurse Nightingale to administration. 20 people looked up. The resident in Trauma 2 pretended he hadn't heard it. The unit clerk wouldn't meet Katie's eyes. A first-year med student actually smirked, that quick flash of schadenfreude that comes from watching someone else get humiliated instead of you. Nightingale. The nickname that had started last month when Katie suggested a protocol change and Caldwell had decided that was her character flaw, too much Nightingale, singing in the dark, making noise where silence was required. He'd been using it ever since like a knife he was sharpening on a whetstone. The echo died. The machines went back to their beeping. But something had shifted in the room. The resident who'd been helping had suddenly found a reason to step out. The tech was avoiding the bay altogether. Caldwell stood at the nurse's station, charting something, looking satisfied the way a man looks when he's moved a chess piece that matters. Katie turned back to Chen. His pressure was 75/40 now. Falling. She pulled up the labs on the computer and saw what she already knew: coagulation profile shot to hell, hemoglobin dropping faster than the transfusions could replace it. He needed the OR. He needed someone to believe he was worth saving. He needed something Katie couldn't give him standing in a trauma bay while her department chief was actively dismantling her credibility with broadcast announcements. She worked anyway. Ordered another unit. Started a second full line with the kind of smooth, practice motion that comes from having done it 1,000 times in places where the power went out and you were just trying to keep someone alive on a stretcher that wasn't moving. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd seen worse and survived it. The scar on her left femur, the titanium rod 3 inches below the skin, tightened as she shifted her weight, but she didn't let her face change. Pain was data. Data was useful. 20 minutes later, Caldwell found her in the supply closet. She was reaching for dressings, her mind already 3 steps ahead to the next patient, the next crisis, the next moment where she'd have to smile and accept that she was just a nurse in a system where just meant invisible. He blocked the door with his body. Not aggressively. Just present in a way that made the small room feel smaller. Your hero complex is generating performance review documentation, Morrison. His voice had that tank-idle quality to it, a low rumble that said he had all the power and all the time. I'm watching you. Every single shift. His breath smelled like coffee and mint. Clinical. Controlled. Like a man who'd rehearsed this conversation and knew exactly how many words would break someone. Katie took one measured breath. Felt a single tear escape, just one, the body's betrayal, not her choice, and wiped it without breaking eye contact. Her voice came out steady, the voice of someone who'd told better men than this that she couldn't save them, and meant it. I've told better men than you that I couldn't save them, Dr. Caldwell. I've never told a patient I wouldn't try. He stepped back like she'd moved him. His face went the color of old clay. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Then he turned and walked out, and Katie was alone in a supply closet surrounded by the tools of a trade that someone had just decided didn't include her anymore. The shift ended at 0700. Caldwell was waiting in the parking lot as the incoming day shift pulled in, their cars rolling through the pre-dawn like a slow funeral procession. He stood there watching her empty her locker, the stuff of 6 years, the trauma shears with her name engraved on them, the compression socks, the granola bar she'd forgotten about, and made his voice carry across the asphalt. Float pool status, effective immediately. Inability to accept medical judgment. Clear your locker by Monday. The incoming nurses pretended they didn't hear it. But they did. Everyone did. The night air was cold. Rain was coming, you could smell it, that electric, waiting smell. Katie's hands didn't shake as she closed her locker for the last time. Her jaw clenched once, a muscle working under skin that had learned not to move where it wasn't supposed to. She turned and walked back toward the hospital entrance because Chen was still in there, and float pool status or not, she wasn't finished. Not even close. The supply closet door closed behind them with a soft click of a latch that sounded like a locked cell. Caldwell's face was the color of raw meat, his jaw working silently for 3 seconds before words came out. Katie stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her breathing unchanged. The fluorescent strip light above them buzzed like an angry wasp. Your hero complex is generating performance review documentation, Caldwell said, his voice dropping to the tone of a man who believed he was being reasonable while he threatened. As of now, there is an official record. Insubordination. Failure to accept clinical judgment. Deviation from protocol. He paused, watching her face. Watching for the tremor he expected. The guilt. The fear. He found nothing. This becomes a termination file unless you accept reassignment and stop this crusade. Katie did not blink. Did not shift her weight. Her hands remained steady, the way they'd remained steady in the field hospital outside Tikrit when mortar rounds were landing in the compound and she was suturing a Marine's carotid artery back together. Pain was data. Fear was irrelevant. Caldwell's words were noise in the background of a life that had already been broken and rebuilt. "Understood, doctor," she said. 4 words. Delivered with the flat precision of someone reading vital signs. He waited for her to say more. To defend herself. To crack. The silence stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. His face darkened. "You're reassigned to post-op overflow, float pool status, effective immediately. You'll take report assignment from whoever's running the board that day. You won't set foot in a trauma bay. You won't participate in resuscitations. You won't." He stopped. He'd run out of things to prohibit. He needed her to acknowledge the punishment. To flinch at it. "Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal, doctor." Caldwell jerked the supply closet door open and walked out into the corridor, expecting her to follow like an employee who'd just been fired. Instead, Katie waited 15 seconds, then stepped back into the hallway as if nothing had happened. Her badge was still clipped to her scrubs. Her hands were still steady. Her heart rate had not elevated by more than 2 beats per minute. The incoming day shift was gathering near the staff entrance, dropping their bags into lockers, checking the assignment board. Caldwell waited for Katie by the parking lot doors, his phone already in his hand, making sure the morning team would see this moment. When she pushed through the glass doors into the San Diego morning, already 87 degrees at 6:13 a.m., he was standing directly in her path. "As of right now, your float pool," he announced, loud enough for the 6 nurses standing 30 feet away to hear clearly. Unable to accept medical judgment. Unable to function within the trauma team structure. He paused, letting that sink into their ears. "I'll be notifying administration of your reassignment. There will be a formal review." Katie took one measured breath. The kind of breath a combat medic takes before entering a fire zone, not panic, not resignation, but the conscious decision to move forward anyway. A single tear escaped her left eye. She did not wipe it immediately. She let it sit there on her cheekbone for 1 full second while she met Caldwell's gaze with the kind of eye contact that made people understand, in their bones, that they had misjudged something fundamental about the person in front of them. Then she wiped it away without breaking his stare. "I've told better men than you that I couldn't save them, Dr. Caldwell," she said, her voice the color of reinforced steel. "I've never told a patient I wouldn't try." She walked past him toward the staff entrance. The nurses by the lockers had gone completely still. One of them, a young resident named Torres, was staring at Katie with the expression of someone who'd just watched a person walk through a closed door. Caldwell stood alone in the parking lot, his face the color of ash now, and Katie did not look back at him once. She went straight to the trauma bay. Not to Caldwell's office. Not to human resources. Not to the parking lot to sit in her car and process the wreckage. She changed into fresh scrubs and positioned herself where she could see the vitals monitor for Trauma 3 from the post-op station. This violated her reassignment. She knew it violated her reassignment. She did it anyway. Chen's blood pressure was still too low. 85/52 at 7:24 a.m. The afternoon shift report came and went, and Katie stayed, moving through the motions of post-op coverage while her eyes tracked the trauma monitor. By 11 p.m., his pressure had drifted further south, 78/48. The night shift had changed over. Caldwell had left the hospital at 5 p.m., leaving instructions with a covering physician, a competent trauma surgeon named Dr. Patel, that Chen was a poor prognostic case, comfort care trajectory, no aggressive interventions. Katie read the chart update in the electronic system and felt something cold settle into her chest. Not fear. Something older than fear. Something that came from a field hospital in Tikrit where she'd learned the difference between what doctors believed was possible and what Major Katie Morrison knew was possible when you refused to accept the mathematics of death. By midnight, Chen's O2 saturation had dropped to 71% despite supplemental oxygen. His blood pressure was holding at 70/40, which meant his body was running on the absolute minimum perfusion needed to keep a human being alive. The 4 lines were running wide open, 2 liters of normal saline, a unit of packed red cells that should have been finished 4 hours ago. His urine output was nearly 0. Acute kidney injury settling in. Multi-organ failure was the trajectory now, the slow cascade of a body shutting down when the oxygen supply couldn't meet the demand. She looked at the clock on the wall, 12:27 a.m. 13 minutes until 1 a.m. 13 minutes until Chen's pressure probably dropped into the range where even comfort care couldn't slow the inevitable. The ventilator wheezed in its rhythmic pattern, the sound of plastic tubes delivering oxygen to lungs that were themselves beginning to fail, the secondary effect of whatever internal bleeding was still happening, whatever injury they hadn't found yet. Katie had not left the hospital. She'd told the post-op coordinator that she was staying late to help with a discharge. She'd changed back into fresh scrubs. She'd positioned herself in a supply room that had a line of sight to Trauma 3, and she'd watched the monitor the way a sniper watches a scope. By 1:15 a.m., Chen's pressure was 62/38. The monitor registered each beat like a prayer nobody was saying anymore. Katie walked into Trauma 3 without knocking. Dr. Patel looked up from his charting. "He's declining," the doctor said, not unkindly. "We should consider calling the family." "Not yet," Katie said. There was something in the tone of those 2 words that made Patel look at her more carefully. She was standing at Chen's bedside with her hands resting on the rail, and her entire posture had changed. The deferential nurse was gone. In her place was something that moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a person who had already survived things that were supposed to kill her. Her jaw was set. Her shoulders had pulled back. When she reached for Chen's wrist to check his pulse manually, her hands moved like they were remembering something her conscious mind hadn't permitted her to think about for 8 years. "I need the thoracotomy kit," Katie said. Not a question. Not a request. "Morrison, we've discussed his trajectory. I need it now, doctor." Patel stared at her. But he was young enough, and smart enough, to recognize the sound of someone who knew what they were doing. He didn't move. But he didn't stop her either. He just watched as Katie pulled open the crash cart drawers with the specific knowledge of exactly where things were located, as if her hands remembered this hospital from another life, another timeline, another war. Chen's blood pressure dropped to 58/36. The monitor beeped twice. Paused. Beeped once more. And Katie Morrison locked the trauma room door behind her and began to do the thing she'd been trained to do by the most elite medical professionals in the military, the thing she'd done in the dust and the blood and the chaos of Tikrit when nobody else could, the thing that was absolutely, categorically, completely outside of her scope of practice as a civilian trauma nurse at Seattle General Hospital in San Diego. The scalpel cut clean. At 0200 hours, the monitor flatlined. Not gradually. Not with the slow decline that gives a room time to prepare. The electrocardiogram dissolved from a jagged rhythm into a straight line, and the sound, that specific high-pitched wail that every trauma nurse has memorized through 18 years of repetition, cut through the trauma bay like a scalpel through muscle. Katie's hand stilled. Chen's chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, the ventilator doing its job, but the electrical activity of his heart had simply ceased. She watched the numbers collapse, blood pressure 40, then 35, then the machine gave up reporting altogether because there was nothing left to measure. O2 sat dropping like a stone. 62, 55, 48. The attending intern looked at her. The respiratory therapist looked at her. Nobody moved. Katie's eyes stayed on the monitor. On the flat line. On the red numbers that meant a man who trained her son, who commanded the team that kept him alive in the dust and the concrete of Tikrit, was dying 3 feet away from her, and she had 17 minutes before Dr. Caldwell arrived to officially call it. Her phone was in the hallway. Caldwell's voice came through the overhead speaker, not in the trauma bay. He was somewhere else in the hospital, somewhere safe where he couldn't see what his refusal to act had created. Codes called. Time of death, 0202. Excellent work, everyone. The radio crackle of dismissal. The clinical precision of a man who'd already moved on to his next statistic, his next board presentation where he could cite the mortality numbers as proof of his competence. Katie reached for the door. She locked it. The click echoed in the sudden silence, residents froze, the intern's hand halfway to the defibrillator pads. The respiratory therapist's fingers stilled on the ventilator knob. Nobody shut down an attending's code. Nobody, in 15 years of Seattle General's rigid hierarchy, had ever overridden Dr. Caldwell's death declarations. Step back, Katie said. Not loud. Not angry. The voice of someone who'd given orders in the dark under the thud of mortar fire, the voice of someone who'd held a field hospital's perimeter while rounds punched through canvas. I have this. The intern started to protest, some babbling about scope of practice, but the respiratory therapist was already moving. She'd seen something in Katie's hands, in the way she was pulling on fresh gloves, in the absolute absence of hesitation. She'd seen the competence of someone who'd done this before. Katie's fingers found Chen's pocket. The MRE packaging was still there, military-grade waterproof material, sterile. She'd know that packaging anywhere. Her son had sent care packages from Tikrit, trying to keep his mother connected to his life in the dust. The timestamps on the messages were always 0300 hours his time, which meant Katie was awake at 1900 hours reading about his unit moving through hostile territory, about the supply runs, about the brothers who died on the same streets where Chen now trained 18-year-old Marines who looked like children. This packaging had Chen's name written on it in careful block letters, for the commander. Katie's son had sent this to his commanding officer. And Chen had been carrying it. She tore open the sterile seal with movements that came from somewhere below conscious thought. Muscle memory. The kind of memory that lives in hands and bones, not in the thinking brain. 8 years ago, in a field hospital outside Baghdad where the walls were canvas and the light was diesel lamp grey and the smell was copper and antiseptic and fear, she'd sealed a chest wound with whatever was available. Combat gauze. Duct tape. The torn packaging from a morphine auto-injector. She'd done it while rounds were hitting the sandbag barriers and her medic, young, only 19, only 6 weeks in theater, was screaming because he'd taken a fragmentation wound to the abdomen and she was telling him to hold still, hold still. She had him, she had him. She had him now, too. The chest wound was still there, the one everyone had missed in the chaos of Chen's arrival, the one buried under the hemorrhage and the trauma of the training accident. A penetrating chest wound meant sucking air. Air meant collapsed lung. Collapsed lung meant the cascade that killed men in minutes if you didn't seal it. Katie found it with her fingertips. The wound, small and vicious, right there in the fourth intercostal space. She'd examined Chen twice while she was supposed to be in post-op. She knew this body now the way she'd known the bodies of 100 soldiers, not as a person but as a system, as machinery that either worked or didn't. She taped the improvised seal with tape from the trauma cart, her hands moving in the rhythm of someone who'd done this before Chen was born, before her son was born, before the IED outside Baghdad had decorated her left femur with titanium and given her a permanent tremor in loud noises that she'd learned to hide with the discipline of a warrior. Then she reached for the scalpel. The residents gasped. The intern actually stepped backward. But Katie's hands were already steady, steadier than they'd been in 8 years of civilian nursing, when she'd had to think about every movement, had to translate the muscle memory into the careful precision of hospital protocol. A resuscitative thoracotomy. Open the chest. Access the heart directly. Find the bleeding, stop it, massage the chambers back to life if they wouldn't do it themselves. She made the incision in one smooth motion. Fourth intercostal space, left side. The anatomical knowledge came without words, between the ribs, through the fascia, through the parietal pleura. She could feel the tissue give, could feel the difference between what belonged and what didn't, could feel the precise moment when she was where she needed to be. The ribs opened under her hands like a book. There. The left ventricle. Pale and still. A heart that had commanded men into fire, that had made decisions that kept people alive, that had been kind to her son in the way that combat officers are kind, by being competent enough that the men beneath them had a chance of coming home. Her fingers found the chambers. She began the massage, gentle but firm, the way you'd massage a heart back to life if it had simply forgotten its job. Not CPR, not the useless chest compressions that had failed to save him. This was direct access. This was the medicine of the field hospital, of the moment when protocols don't matter because the patient is either going to die or you're going to save him with your hands and your training and the refusal to let someone else's failure become his death sentence. 60 compressions per minute. The same rhythm as a heartbeat. The same rhythm as boots on tile, 1, 2, 3, 4, the same rhythm as the rotor wash of the medevac helicopters that had carried her soldiers away from the dust and toward something like safety. The monitor was still flat. She kept working. No hesitation. No doubt. Just the specific knowledge that comes from having been somewhere worse, from having held the line when there was no backup coming, when the choice was save them or let them die, and she'd chosen to save them with whatever she had. The respiratory therapist was still at the ventilator. The intern was frozen. The residents were watching with the kind of silence that meant they were seeing something they didn't have a framework for: a trauma nurse performing surgery, breaking every boundary between what a nurse does and what only a doctor is allowed to do. Katie's hands kept moving. And then 90 systolic. The blood pressure cuff cycled and displayed a number that should have been impossible. 90. Systolic. Climbing. The monitor twitched. A single beat. Then another. Then the rhythm settled into something almost normal, something almost alive, and Katie's hands found the heart's pulse under her fingertips, that specific sensation of tissue moving with purpose, of blood flowing where it had stopped, of a man deciding to come back. Chen's eyes opened. Just barely. Just enough. The pupils reactive, the eyes tracking movement, the awareness that meant his brain was getting oxygen and blood and all the things a human body needs to remember how to be a human. The trauma bay door opened. Dr. Caldwell stopped in the threshold. He'd been approaching with the measured pace of someone coming to document a death, to add another name to his column of statistics, to review the case later with a kind of detached professionalism that made it clear he'd done everything right and the body had simply failed him. But the monitor was beeping. Chen was breathing, shallow, labored, but present. The blood pressure cuff was cycling and displaying 92 systolic. And Katie Morrison was standing over the open chest of a code, with her hands inside Chen's body and her eyes absolutely steady, and on her face was the specific expression of someone who had just run the only play left and watched it work. For 3 seconds, Caldwell didn't move. Then he turned and walked back out. The calls came from the hallway. Katie could hear them through the still-open door, his voice sharp, clipped, giving orders with the precision of someone who'd just understood that the narrative had shifted and he needed to move fast. "Richard, it's Caldwell. I need the board chairman's direct line. We have a liability situation. Major situation." Katie's hands kept moving, kept working. She was closing now, running the procedure in reverse, getting Chen stable enough for the surgical team, getting the chest closed, getting him to whoever could do the rest of what needed to be done. Behind her, the intern was finally moving, was finally understanding that the code was over, that this was a living person now, that the impossible thing had just happened. HR, immediate termination paperwork. Gross insubordination, practicing beyond scope, patient endangerment. I want it filed within the hour. The respiratory therapist was making notes. Documentation. The other residents were trying very hard not to make eye contact, trying very hard not to be the ones who'd watched Major Katie Morrison perform a resuscitative thoracotomy and had done nothing to stop her. Security, I want her credentials deactivated immediately. And pull whoever accessed the trauma log on Chen in the past 6 hours. I want names. The surgical team arrived, called before Caldwell made the calls, Katie realized dimly. Someone had initiated the next step of care the moment Chen's vitals recovered. Someone had decided the code wasn't over, and maybe it had been the respiratory therapist, maybe it had been the resident, maybe it had been Katie herself communicating through the one language she still spoke fluently, the language of a body that wouldn't let itself die on her watch. Caldwell stood in the doorway watching them transfer Chen to the surgical suite. Watching the EKG cable get unplugged. Watching the monitors get moved. Watching the evidence of what had just happened walk past him toward the OR. His face had gone the color of hospital walls. Pale. Thin. Like something essential had been drained out and he was just the outline left behind. Katie pulled off her gloves. She looked at him once, not with anger, not with vindication, but with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who'd learned a long time ago that the people you save don't owe you anything, and the people who try to stop you from saving them are their own consequences. She walked past him in the hallway. Security arrived 12 minutes later. 2 officers in the blue blazers of hospital security, with expressions that suggested they'd been briefed on something but weren't quite sure if they believed it. Caldwell had apparently explained that Katie was being removed for her own safety and the hospital's protection, which was a legal fiction everyone involved understood immediately. They didn't rough her up. They were professional, respectful, the way security guards are when they've been told the person they're escorting out is probably someone important. But professional didn't make it less humiliating. It didn't make her hospital ID, swiped at the front desk, rejected, handed back by a nursing assistant who wouldn't meet her eyes, feel like anything less than erasure. Her locker key didn't work when she tried it. The fluorescent lights of the staff break room suddenly felt like they turned against her, bright and cold and indifferent. She left her personal items there, the photograph of her husband and her son, taken 10 years ago when Chen was just another junior officer and David was still alive, still whole. She couldn't carry them out. Couldn't carry anything except the knowledge that Chen's eyes had opened, that his blood pressure had climbed, that she'd done the one thing that mattered. The rain started around 0400 hours. Katie drove to the cemetery in silence. Her phone had been buzzing against the car seat since she left Seattle General, calls from blocked numbers, from medical review boards, from someone who identified herself as HR but sounded like a lawyer. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. She knew what the calls meant. She'd known the moment Caldwell turned and walked away. Her husband's grave was in a section called Eternal Rest, which Katie had always found obscene. Nothing about David Morrison's death had been restful. He'd been killed by an IED outside Kandahar, and the notification had come to her at 0300 hours while she was working a trauma bay in Germany, and she'd finished her shift because that was the job, that was what soldiers did, they finished the job even when their hands were shaking. The headstone read, Captain David Morrison, U.S. Army, beloved husband and father. She held the dog tag, his dog tag, the one she'd carried for 6 years like a talisman, and let the rain soak through her scrubs. The cold didn't matter. The wet didn't matter. Nothing mattered except that she'd saved Chen and lost her job, and soon she'd have to call her son and explain that the future she'd been building, the civilian life she'd constructed carefully with the wreckage of her military career, had just collapsed. She whispered into the rain, I saved his commander, but I'm going to lose everything we built anyway, and I don't know how to tell our son I failed. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. But the shaking started anyway, not from the cold, not from the rain, but from the specific knowledge that you can do everything right and still lose, that competence doesn't protect you from institutional power, that there are battles you can win and still be destroyed for winning them. The rain hammered down harder, and Katie Morrison stood at her husband's grave and held the broken chain tight, and understood that the next morning was going to change everything. The rain stopped sometime before dawn. Katie didn't notice. She'd been standing at James Morrison's grave for 4 hours, long enough for the cold to stop being a sensation and become a fact of her body, the same way her left leg had stopped being pain and become architecture. 6 years she'd carried his dog tag. 6 years the chain had held. Now, standing in the pre-dawn dark with the broken metal digging into her palm, she understood that some things held you together only until the moment they didn't. The hospital records office opened at 7:30. Katie knew because she'd looked at the clock on her phone, 0731, when the first administrator's assistant called to ask her to come in for a routine meeting. She'd already been awake. She'd already known what was coming. There's a sound that institutional power makes when it closes around you. Not dramatic. Not loud. just the soft, systematic click of doors locking, one after another, in a sequence designed by someone who understood that efficiency is more terrifying than rage. By 8 o'clock, Dr. Caldwell had already reassigned the 3 residents who'd been present during Chen's resuscitation. The first, Dr. Reeves, third-year surgical resident, was transferred to the orthopedic ward effective immediately. He'd been Katie's strongest ally in the trauma bay, the one who'd moved without hesitation when she directed him. The second resident, Dr. Cho, found herself reassigned to pediatrics, a career lateral move that everyone understood was a punishment. The third, Dr. Jackson, got the worst of it, the night shift in the rural clinic satellite 47 miles outside San Diego, which meant his entire residency track had just been derailed. By noon, none of them would return Katie's messages. They couldn't. Caldwell had made sure of that. The computer access went next. Katie's ID badge still granted her physical entry to the hospital. They hadn't been sloppy enough to do that yet, but when she tried to log into the electronic health record system at 08 for 5 hours, the screen went black. Access denied. The message appeared in cold Helvetica: "You do not have authorization to view patient information." She tried 3 times. The third attempt locked her out entirely and generated an automatic email to hospital IT flagged for suspicious access attempts. Caldwell's signature was on the authorization order, copied to HR, copied to the chief medical officer. 2 clicks. The entire digital hospital closed itself to her. Then came the termination file. Katie's attorney would see it later, would shake his head at the precision of it. Documentation of gross insubordination and practicing beyond scope of nursing license, including Caldwell's handwritten notes from the supply closet confrontation, which meant he'd documented his own threat as if it had been a professional warning, plus the video from Trauma Bay where she'd initiated resuscitation without physician order, plus her failure to accept medical judgment when Caldwell had called the code from across the hospital. It was a masterpiece of institutional weaponry. Nothing he'd done was technically false. It was just arranged in a way that made her look dangerous, unstable, and litigious. Any hospital reviewing that file would not hire her. Any licensing board reviewing that file would consider further investigation. Any plaintiff's attorney reviewing that file would see liability. Security came at 0920 hours. Not roughly. That would have been easier. The security chief, a man named Rodriguez who'd always nodded to her in the hallway, simply appeared at the trauma bay entrance with a neutral expression and a clipboard. She was escorting Katie Morrison to her vehicle for her own safety and the safety of patients, per executive directive. Katie didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She simply walked, her limp slightly more pronounced than usual because the rain from the graveyard had stiffened her femur in a way that heat and movement usually loosened. Behind her, Chen's monitors beeped with the steady rhythm of a successful resuscitation, his blood pressure climbing past 90 systolic, his oxygen saturation rising, his eyes open and aware. Everything she'd done had worked. Everything she'd accomplished had succeeded. And none of it mattered against the institutional machinery that had decided she was a problem. That night, Katie stood at James's grave again. Same spot. Same rain, though lighter now, falling like breath. The dog tag felt different in her hand, lighter, maybe, or maybe she'd just become aware that holding it was the only part of her that still belonged anywhere. She'd saved Chen. She'd defied physics and procedure and every regulation Caldwell had thrown at her. She'd done what a medic was supposed to do, keep someone alive. And in doing it, she'd destroyed the future she'd built. Civilian identity. Quiet career. The small apartment in Ocean Beach where she and her son had started learning how to be a family again. The job she'd worked toward for 8 years because she couldn't imagine not serving but couldn't bear to do it in uniform anymore. All of it gone. Burned down by a man in a suit who was terrified of having his mortality statistics disturbed by a nurse who'd actually known how to keep people from dying. "I saved his commander," she whispered to the grave. Her voice sounded strange in the wet dark, like something being played back through water. "I saved Lieutenant Chen, but I'm going to lose everything we built anyway. The apartment. My job. The consultant contract I was going to start next month. And I don't know how to tell our son I failed. I don't know how to explain that doing the right thing got me destroyed by someone whose job depends on not doing it. The rain hammered down harder, moving from breath to applause. Katie didn't move. She stood there for another hour, the dog tag hanging from her open hand, and understood with the kind of clarity that only comes at 4 in the morning that she was probably fired by now. That the termination papers were probably already in her file. That by the time the hospital opened for business today, everyone would know that nurse Katie Morrison had overstepped, had ignored orders, had practiced beyond her scope, and had been appropriately removed from patient care. The official story was already written. The conspiracy was complete. What happened next happened fast, the way institutional revelations do when someone finally pulls a thread on the right tapestry. The hospital records office flagged something at 0615 hours the next morning. A routine background check, standard procedure for anyone consulting with government agencies, had been run on the personnel file of one Catherine Ann Morrison, former float pool nurse. The system flagged her classified security clearance. TSSCI level. Active status. Sponsored by the Defense Intelligence Agency. The flag went to hospital administration. The flag went to HR. The flag went to the medical director. And the flag, somehow, made its way to an inbox at Naval Base San Diego where someone saw a name and a clearance level and recognized something that Seattle General's administrative staff did not. By 9 o'clock, Katie's son was in the administrator's office. He was wearing his dress uniform, blues, not desert camis, because he'd flown in from Tikrit 17 hours ago on emergency leave, the kind of leave that only happens when something catastrophic occurs in your immediate family. He was 24 years old. He had the same jawline as his father, the same composure, the same way of standing that made ordinary rooms feel smaller. His name tape read Morrison. His rank was lieutenant, junior grade, United States Navy. "I'm here to understand," he said to the administrator, his voice carrying the specific gravity of military courtesy, "why my mother was terminated from her nursing position at Seattle General yesterday evening." The administrator, a woman named Dr. Patel who'd inherited this meeting when Caldwell had suddenly become unavailable, opened the termination file. She'd read it twice already. She knew what was coming. But she wasn't prepared for what her eyes actually registered when her hand started to tremble and she began reading the file out loud, her voice getting steadier as she moved through the content because some facts demanded respect. "Bronze Star," she heard herself say, looking at the document. "Decoration for Valor. 2008, Operation Iraqi Freedom." She paused. Her hands were shaking. "Purple Heart. 2009, combat-related injury, femoral fracture and shrapnel lacerations, treated at Ballard Air Base." Another pause. "Second Purple Heart. 2010, Dr. Patel's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. 18 months. She was embedded with SEAL Team 3 for 18 months. Combat medic rating. Field hospital coordinator. The office door opened. A man in civilian clothes, tan and scarred across the left side of his face, stood in the doorway with the specific presence of someone who'd spent enough time in combat zones that civilian spaces still felt too soft. His name was Gator. That was what everyone called him. His actual rank was Master Chief Petty Officer. He'd flown in from Coronado on the same transport as Katie's son. "Major Morrison," Gator said, and the room registered the rank like a physical shock, held a field hospital under sustained mortar fire for 11 hours. Fallujah, 2008. 6 Marines came in categorized as expectant. She kept all 6 of them alive until medevac arrived. She trained approximately half the combat medics currently deployed in theater. "The reason your men know how to stay alive, sir, is because Major Morrison taught them how." The FBI liaison arrived at that exact moment, which meant the timing had been coordinated. Everything about this moment had been coordinated. Federal badge. Serious expression. Ms. Morrison's classified clearance was refreshed 3 weeks ago, the liaison said, looking at Dr. Patel the way someone looks at a problem that's about to solve itself. "She's been cleared to consult on a medical training program under Department of Defense contract." That clearance supersedes hospital employment protocols. That clearance, the liaison continued, pulling out a document sealed with a Navy Medical Corps insignia, means that Major Morrison was never your employee to fire. She was operating in a different capacity entirely. Caldwell's face, when he finally appeared in the doorway, was grey. Not figuratively. Actual grey, the color of someone whose institutional power had just evaporated at the atomic level. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tried again. There's been a misunderstanding. No, the FBI liaison said, and the single word was a door closing. There hasn't. That evening, Dr. Caldwell appeared on the local news. His makeup was orange under the studio lights. His hands were steady, because he was still a good actor, but his eyes had the quality of someone playing a role he no longer believed in. The anchor asked him about the personnel matter at Seattle General. We cannot verify the credentials of former staff, Caldwell said, and the word sounded hollow now, rehearsed, desperate. And patient safety protocols exist for a reason. Our hospital maintains rigorous standards. The phone lines lit up. The first call was from Admiral James Holloway, retired 3-star commander of U.S. Special Operations Command. 8 million people watching the live stream heard his voice cut through the studio like a blade. I can verify Major Katie Morrison's credentials personally, Admiral Holloway said. I was there. She saved 17 of my men in Tikrit. She's the most decorated medic I've ever worked with. And while we're verifying things, perhaps you can verify why your hospital falsified a veteran's medical chart in 2019 to avoid a Medicare audit. I have the documentation right here. I have the signatures. And I'm about to send it to the Arizona Medical Board. The feed went viral in 47 minutes. 8 million viewers became 12 million. Screenshots of Caldwell's social media posts mocking a Nurse Nightingale types who think they're heroes started circulating. By midnight, the hospital board had reviewed the security footage. By 1 a.m., they'd found his authorization orders blocking documentation. By 2 a.m., they'd called an emergency meeting. By 3 a.m., Caldwell's attorney had stopped returning his calls. 6 months later, Katie Morrison walked through the main entrance of Seattle General wearing a consultant lanyard. Department of Defense Medical Training Contract. She was here to train the trauma staff in combat casualty protocols, the same protocols that had saved Lieutenant Marcus Chen's life. Her son met her for lunch at 1,200 hours. He was in civilian clothes now, on leave from Tikrit, wearing a polo shirt and jeans and the specific calm of someone who'd inherited his mother's composure. They were walking toward the cafeteria when Katie saw him. Dr. Caldwell. In a blue polyester security guard uniform, checking visitor badges at the front desk. His name tag was crooked. His hand shook slightly as he scanned her consultant badge. Katie stopped. She looked at him for one measured moment, the same quiet dignity she'd carried through every insult, every humiliation, every moment when institutional power had tried to break her and failed. She nodded. Just once. The same acknowledgment she gave every person who underestimated her. Then she walked past, her son's arm around her shoulders, the dog tag visible now on a chain that was no longer broken. Behind them, through the cafeteria windows, the trauma bay was visible in the afternoon light. On her lantern, under her name, Major, U.S. Army Reserve, retired. Her son said something that made her laugh. Real laugh. The kind that comes from someone who's learned that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding everything together, and that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've made it this far, you already know the truth. The ones who change the world aren't usually the ones with the loudest voices. Subscribe to see more stories about people who've been underestimated. Like and comment if you've ever been judged by someone who didn't know your story. Because every person you pass might be carrying armor you'll never see.